Earlier this year, every month, I used to go for lunch with a group of my female friends. Of the four of us who would meet up in a restaurant that was definitely posher than we could afford, one of us happened to be transgender. Now, like a lot of women before us, we used to do something really, really embarrassing at those lunches, something that you will not believe still happens in 2018. We used to argue over who was Miranda, Carrie, Charlotte, and Samantha from Sex and the City. But eventually, we had to stop meeting up for lunch. My friend who was trans kept having to cancel because her mental health wasn't up to it. Because while three of us could use the bathroom of our choosing without having to think twice, my friend was scared to do so, scared that she wasn't welcome. My friend, one of the bravest people I know, the Samantha of the group, was finding it difficult to leave the house. Now, it might seem strange that things could be so hard for my friend in a time when trans people are writing best-selling books and walking down catwalks. But with visibility comes polarization. We are living in an increasing climate of hatred and confusion towards trans people. And so I keep finding myself having the same conversation again and again recently with family, with friends, and with colleagues about transgender rights and whether or not we should support them. As someone who identifies as the L in LGBT, I think it's easy to see why I should support transgender rights. I know what it's like to have someone stare at you in the street, yell at you, or suspect that you have ulterior motives. I might not know what it's actually like to be transgender, but I can try to empathize. And I can see that historically we've been stronger together, LGB and T. What we hear about less is why feminists should support transgender rights. In fact, more often we hear the opposite. We hear people who describe themselves as feminists taking issue with trans people. Sometimes they target transgender men, but mostly they seem to focus on transgender women, and specifically arguing over whether trans women are real women or else just labeling them as dangerous. I first noticed this about a year and a half ago, but it's actually been going on even longer. I noticed it in the pages of magazines and newspapers I've written for in my work as a journalist. Well-known writers were claiming that trans people are indoctrinating kids to change their gender, or in other extreme cases, they were comparing being trans to having a mental illness. Even writers I liked in papers I read were joining in the conversation. And when a young trans girl was elected as a women's officer for the Labour Party, she was vilified. She was taking up spots meant for real women. We were not celebrating this 19-year-old's dreams to become a politician, but instead denouncing her as a fake. When a young non-binary person, that's someone who doesn't identify as male or female, used the girls' changing room in Topshop, they were held up as a threat to kids across Britain. But they just wanted to try on some clothes, not sexually assault anyone. I talk to my trans friends about this so-called debate, and they tell me it makes them feel afraid, persecuted, apathetic. They show me the tweets they receive as the situation worsens, misgendering, death threats, people arguing over their very right to exist. Like my friend I mentioned earlier, they tell me that it makes them want to withdraw from their social lives. I talk to my cisgender friends, that's people who are not trans, about what is happening, and they tell me that they feel bad for trans people, worried even, but that they can't totally condemn what is happening. Privately, these often professional and progressive women tell me that they find it difficult to reconcile their feminism with transgender rights. They wonder, if anyone can become a woman, doesn't that begin to undermine the very idea of what a woman is? Doesn't that mean a woman can be, well, anything? To that I say, yes, a woman can be anything. Show me two women who look the same, have the same experiences, or the same biological makeup. There are not two of us in this room. But today I want to focus on another question, one that I hear even more often. And that's, if anyone can change their gender, doesn't that mean that men can start identifying as women and come into spaces like domestic violence shelters or public toilets and do us harm? Today, I want to focus on this question because I believe that if those of us who exist in the grey area can be made to see why this way of thinking is harmful, we might genuinely help to save people's lives. I'll start by saying, and this is important, I call myself a feminist. I believe in equal rights for women, and as well as writing about LGBT issues in my career, I've written countless articles about women's rights. As someone who's experienced sexual assault by a male perpetrator, I get the concern over women's safety, over who can use gendered spaces and facilities. But trans people are not the problem, and to act like they are doesn't make a great deal of sense. Here are 3 basic reasons why. First, we need to ask, who's checking? How do we practically check who isn't trans on entry to a space? 30 years ago, there was a similar panic happening about gay people as there is about trans people today. We were worried about gay people joining the military, about gay people using single-sex spaces. We were worried that people like me would be looking under your toilet door. Of course, since then, we've largely worked out that this is what we call homophobia, that gay people have better things to do than spying on people, and that, crucially, you can't necessarily tell who is gay just by looking at them. Sexuality is on a spectrum. The same is true of gender. We can't necessarily tell who is trans, and besides, lots of cisgender people do not conform to typical understandings of gender. Butch women, effeminate men, how would we police them? Would we have assigned gender checkers, facial recognition scanning, or require certificates on entry to toilets? The problem with policing gender like this is that it reinforces the idea we all need to look convincingly cisgender. But this is difficult and expensive for trans people, and you might not actually want to get surgery. Should you have to? Doesn't policing gender like this also go against what feminists have historically fought for? To free women from the expectation of having to look feminine. Deciding on face value who is or isn't female enough to enter a space, well, that just reinforces the gender norms that oppress all of us. The idea that we can't really practically police gender brings me on to my next point, that when it comes to gendered spaces, trans people have been using them for a really long time. When I talk to trans or non-binary friends of mine, they tell me that they've been using the bathroom of their choosing for years. And in a survey of rape and domestic violence shelters in the UK, it's been found that most already welcome and accommodate trans people with no issue. On top of that, there are already several countries where people can legally self-determine their gender and use the bathroom that they want to. In Malta, Belgium, Ireland, Denmark, Norway, Colombia, Argentina, and did I say Portugal? This is already the case. Rates of sexual violence have not directly increased. And that's because of the upsetting fact that if somebody was a sexual predator and wanted to commit a sexual crime, they would probably do so anyway, without legally self-determining their gender or infiltrating a same-sex space first. If you look at the statistics for sexual crimes, most are not committed in public bathrooms or changing rooms. They're committed in private spaces like the victim's home, or else out in the open. And they are certainly not committed by innocent transgender people like my friend that I used to go for lunch with. And so to my last point, that if we want to reduce sex crimes, we need to police rapists, not trans people. What we're really talking about here is sexual violence, and we're conflating it with transgender rights. But it is not fair to use trans people as the thin end of the wedge in a conversation about rape culture and toxic masculinity, especially not when trans people are at higher risk of violence than most of us. The average life expectancy for a trans woman in the Americas is between 30 and 35 years old. And if you go on a website called the Transgender Day of Remembrance project, which tracks the murder of trans people killed globally, for 2018, there are already 300 entries. And that's not even all of them. That's just the ones that are listed. Personally, here in the UK, I do not know a single trans person who has not been physically attacked. Trans women, and specifically trans women of colour, are at higher risk of not just murder, but domestic abuse and sexual assault. And yet, if we do not let them into domestic violence shelters or women's refuges or even public bathrooms, where are they supposed to go? Into men's ones, presenting as women? It's a depressing thought, and one that makes it easy to see why trans people disproportionately suffer mental health problems. Wouldn't all of us face with the same prospect of violence? Last year, I interviewed someone called Lala Zanel at the Anti-Violence Project, a charity in America that fights homophobia and transphobia. We were sitting in her office in New York talking about the spike in transphobic hate crimes in 2017. How 2 trans women had just been killed within the space of 48 hours in America. She told me that the cultural climate directly affects these statistics, from Trump rolling back transgender rights to the amount of transphobia that we see in the news, because it makes people think they have a free pass to enact violence. In other words, this isn't just a philosophical debate about gender. We can argue all day, but trans people are dying, and I don't want to be part of a feminism that allows that to happen, let alone encourages it. I worry that, in the wake of Me Too, women are misplacing their anger and their fear, that we are using trans people as scapegoats for a problem that has absolutely nothing to do with them. But this has to stop here. Instead, we need to start focusing on our similarities, not our differences. We have a lot in common, cis women and trans women, a lot more to talk about than just toilets. Our bodies are policed constantly, we're at high risk of violence from men, and we're both statistically paid less. We're both treated as second-class citizens because of our biology and our gender. But ultimately, we're fighting for the same things: safety and respect. If feminism is a movement that stands for equality, shouldn't we be helping each other to get these things? There are lots of small things we can do to make life better for trans people. We can listen more. There are lots of trans voices out there to follow who are amazing. These are some of the people that taught me everything I know about transgender rights, so get out your phone later and follow them if you can. We can include trans people in our workplaces or at events like this one. And we can call out transphobia when we see or hear it. But there is something even easier we can all do to make life better for trans people as feminists. And that's ask ourselves a simple question. Not are trans women real women, or are trans men real men, but is feminism really feminism if it oppresses people? Thank you.